Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Faster Rail in Australia What's Different This Time webinar. My name's Andrew Hiles. I'm from the National Faster Rail Agency, and I'll be hosting the session this afternoon. But first up, I'd like to take the opportunity to thank Veach Consulting for making this webinar possible. If we can start off with the proceedings with, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet and pay my respects to their elders past, present and future. I would also like to extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples who are attending today. In my case, I'm the Ngunnawal people are the custodians of the land from which I joined today, while the custodians of the land from which our two Australian-based panellists join us are the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations and the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. As I mentioned, my name's Andrew Hiles. I'm the General Manager at the National Faster Rail Agency, which was established on the 1st of July last year to lead the Australian Government's 20-year Faster Rail plan. If you'd like to know more about the National Faster Rail Agency and its work, please check out its website, www.nfra.gov.au. So with our panellists today, I'm keen to explore a number of issues around faster rail in Australia, including how we could create a viable faster rail system, given our unique population and settlement characteristics, what we can learn from past experiences, as well as international best practice, and probably more importantly, the potential impact of the coronavirus pandemic on regional decentralisation and the role of the infrastructure in the economic recovery. The panel will be a Q&A format, and I'll start the ball rolling with some questions, but feel free to enter your questions into the chat box, which hopefully is on the right-hand side of your screen, and I'll endeavour to ask the panel those questions in the second half of the session today. So on to our panellists. From the Grattan Institute, I'm joined by the Transport and Cities Program Director, Marion Terrell. Among a host of other achievements, Marion most recently led the publication of a key Grattan Institute report on opportunities for faster rail in Australia, titled Fast Train Fever, Why Renovated Rail Might Work But Bullet Trains Won't. Welcome, Marion. From Veach Consulting, we are joined by Principal Consultant Vincent Benizek. Vincent has been producing forecasts and economic analysis for multiple fast rail and high-speed rail projects in France and Australia, and is a key member of the VLC team. Welcome, Vincent. And from Early Morning in the UK, we are joined by Professor Andrew McNaughton, who is a world expert on faster and high-speed rail and has played an instrumental leading role in project and advisory roles in this area internationally, and in particular Europe and Australia. Welcome, Andrew.
Thank you. Morning.
So if we can kick off, Marion, if I can turn to you first, the Grattan Institute has come out strongly against high-speed rail in Australia. Do you think there is consensus among planners that high-speed trains should no longer be considered a solution for Australia?
Thanks, Andrew, and hi, everyone. So by way of background, as Andrew said, I published a report called Fast Train Fever, where my co-authors and I argued against high-speed rail, although we were a lot more circumspect about faster rail. So our arguments against high-speed rail were threefold. We first of all argued that relative to the countries that already have bullet trains, our population here is too small and too spread out. Secondly, although people think that it would be very helpful to us achieving our emissions reduction goals, that's actually not really the case. And thirdly, there's a lot of issues with the 2013 feasibility study that suggest if it were redone today, that the finding wouldn't be favourable. Things like the decision to build a second Sydney airport. So, as you say, I have come out strongly against high-speed rail. But is this the consensus among planners? There's never consensus among planners, I would say. And I'm sure will become clear today. And I think, of course, if there was consensus, even if there was consensus really for this proposal, it would have to start at the political level. For big projects like this to get up, they need a political champion. And there has been a political champion, of course, for high-speed rail here, which is the Federal Labor Party. So at this stage, I'd say public support for the idea has gone pretty quiet. And given how much the environment for major infrastructure investment has changed with COVID-19, it may remain off the agenda. But I think the proof will really be whether the ALP is prepared to champion this idea again as part of its platform at the next election.
Thanks, Marion. So, Andrew, you've obviously, as I mentioned before, been advising governments in both Australia and Europe about fast and high-speed rail. Do you think we're any closer to settling a view on whether high-speed rail is right for Australia?
Probably not. I agree very much with a lot of what Marion's just said. But there's a couple of things that give me more hope that a consensus of sorts will appear. And you're absolutely right. There never is, you never get 100% of people all agreeing on something anywhere in this world. So I don't really see that as much of a problem. The key issue is, yes, of course, it's politically led. Major infrastructure that changes the way people live and work is fundamentally political. It's not about transport. It's fundamentally not a transport issue. It is about where people are going to live and work and play over the next 100 years. I think the New South Wales Premier, Berejiklian, summed it up quite nicely when she said, are we all going to live in 2 or 3 major cities, endlessly expanding, a sort of dystopian future of sprawling megacities? Or are we going to build up our regional cities where people want to live? But how do we build them up? How do we create an economic environment through better connectivity? So the key question becomes not how fast you go. Is it a bullet train? Is it a red train? Is it a green train? And I have those conversations all over the world. Don't worry, you're not unique. You said at the start, Andrew, you're unique. You are not unique. Strangely, the laws of physics work just the same in Australia. The sun rises at the same time. You know, you're not unique. There are some challenges. We'll come to those later, I'm sure. It is this. It is not about transport. It is about how do you create sustainable cities that are not sprawling megacities. Transport connectivity is a key issue. What is the best form of transport connectivity that achieves a result? And if fast rail is part of that, then it's worth doing. And if fast rail makes diddly squat difference, it's not worth doing. And those are the questions we've been trying to answer in New South Wales.
Excellent, thank you. So, Vincent, in your role, or various roles over time, you've had an opportunity to crunch the numbers and do the modelling, developing forecasts and economic analysis, both here in Australia and in France. What do you think about the opportunity for high-speed rail in Australia?
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. Sorry, I was on mute. The classic. I wanted to be in complete agreement with Marion and Andrew's just said about high-speed rail when we talk about these 300k bullet trains going from Melbourne to Brisbane. That probably doesn't make much sense here because of the sparsity of the population, the very long distances, and the cost that this would involve. And I'm not sure I would have very much to add on that one, but I would also mention something. Andrew just said that it's not a transport issue, it's really about population. I would add also that in many countries, high-speed rail was not a transport issue solely, it was also an industrial issue. And if you look at the list of countries which have high-speed rail networks and look at the biggest ones, for some reason they all have a very strong will to maintain their industries in terms of building these train sets, building this high-speed rail, actual like the wagons, and this is a really industrial, like a political choice to maintain these industries. And I think the situation in Australia is very different, where there's already been some decision to sustain the car industry, and probably it will be the same about the train industry. And I think that's a key factor about why probably in Australia it would end up being a vast network with technologies that isn't yours and that you would have to buy from abroad, basically sustaining these industries abroad. So, just one additional thing to add here.
Thanks, Vincent. So I guess the kind of the current COVID pandemic is quite interesting in its potential impacts and long-term implications. Obviously, the arrival of COVID has halted or temporarily halted Australia's population growth, but notwithstanding that, we're still expecting some kind of, return to a growth, population growth scenario. Hopefully, once we have a vaccine and get on top of the pandemic. Much of the population growth, is predicted to occur in Sydney and Melbourne in particular, but also South East Queensland. What infrastructure investment should we be thinking about as government's doing now to ensure Australia maintains its standard of living? And is there a role for faster rail in here? And Andrew, I'll put that question to you.
Okay. COVID, I think, as an issue is in the kind of timescales that we talk about for major investment. COVID is a temporary, albeit rather unpleasant phenomenon. The fundamentals of human life aren't going to change medium-long term. But what I think it has done is give a good kick up the backside to some trends which were happening anyway. And that really is for people who are in professional white-collar jobs. Why do you do a daily commute? You can work remotely quite a lot of the time. What we have discovered as the time wears on is that those people who got established networks, professional networks, are able to maintain them quite well remotely. But young people who are trying to build their careers, how the hell do they develop? How do they learn from their peers? Just doesn't really happen remotely very well. And also, many of the senior leaders that I meet now say, we've got to get together. We need to build strategy. It's one thing to manage remotely. It's another thing to lead remotely. So all that leads to, we can go and live somewhere nice, better schools, better working environment, better quality of life, but we need to have good connectivity back to the centre. Now, we were seeing that before COVID. This is really pushing it along. If I look at my country, I'm going to give you the example of the first high-speed railway, where most of the trains run at 230 kilometres an hour. They're long-distance trains, but they're not super-fast bullet trains. And that serves an area of the country called Kent, which was dying on its feet economically. The old industry shutting down, around 2 hours from London, no job opportunities. When we installed high-speed 1 15 years ago, first of all, people got access to good jobs who were starting their careers without having to move and live in a garret in London. What we didn't expect was a very large number of professional people then moved into these failing cities, because actually the environment was potentially pretty good. Places like Canterbury, Margate, places on the coast. Oh, you guys like living on the coast, don't you, quite a lot? The issue I'm coming to is this. People discovered that it wasn't about commuting. It was about living and building their lives remote from the big city, but they still had the umbilical cord. As a result, property values went up, new development happened, new jobs were created. We can say for every person who moved out of London, they probably support 2 other key jobs. School teachers, even baristas, for heaven's sake. Also all manner of jobs, builders. So it's not just a white collar issue. It only happened because of high-speed rail. Now, or high-speed 1. Clearly, the fare box doesn't pay for that, but the economic development has been assessed as being already, after 13 years, more value than the original infrastructure cost. It has paid for itself in economic uplift in just over a decade, and now it's going to keep. It's like the gift that keeps giving. It's going to keep paying. That was the right solution. It brought people within an hour of London rather than being 2 hours or 2.5 hours from London. That was the transformational thing. Back to, it's not, it was fast enough to get to that magical 1 hour when it changed the relationship between the cities. That's what you need to look for in Australia, not get into a game about can we replace a few aeroplanes with trains. Back to the regional argument that I think is playing out increasingly around Melbourne, it's certainly playing out around Greater Sydney. I've probably said enough. I'll come back to you. Okay.
Thanks, Andrew. Marion, obviously the Grattan Institute is cold on the idea of high-speed rail. Andrew's talked a bit about the opportunity for faster rail, getting that sweet spot in terms of commutability, that kind of thing. What are your views about how we go about potentially addressing some of the in some cases pretty obvious shortfalls with regional passenger rail in Australia? I mean, are they things that we should be focusing on, or are there more pressing priorities elsewhere in our transport system, or investments that governments might make?
Yeah, so these regional upgrades are a very different proposition to high-speed rail. As Andrew says, they're a lot less expensive and less ambitious, really, in terms of what they're seeking to do. And there's a whole lot of them on the table in Australia, as many people listening would know. They're essentially links between a series of regional cities, or in some cases towns, but mainly cities, and their state capital of Sydney, Melbourne or Brisbane. And some of them probably do have a lot of promise. I guess to answer your question, though, I think we do need to back up and ask, what is the problem that we're trying to solve here? So I think the solution has to be relevant to the actual problem and the best way of addressing it. Of the arguments that people make for these regional rail upgrades, I think that the most credible is to improve connection between a large and relatively nearby regional city and the relevant capital, where we know that plenty of people are already making the trip on a regular basis. And that's because we just sort of know the demand is there. And as Andrew says, if you can get the time of the trip down, then that you could expect that demand to grow. So for Sydney, the biggest daily influx is from the Central Coast region, which is home to 25,000 workers, followed by Wollongong with 19,000 workers living in Wollongong, commuting to Sydney. Here in Melbourne, it's Geelong, where there's 14,000 who do the commute. For Brisbane, it's the Gold Coast with 29,000. So we do hear different arguments about what is the problem we're trying to address. And the most common ones that I've come across are that it will take pressure off the capital city, and also that it will grow the region. So it's part of a decentralisation agenda. I think I'll make a comment about the taking the pressure off the capital city. And this is a bit pre-COVID, I've got to say, because population growth's fallen off a cliff. But people were concerned about this before. But I think it's sort of an unrealistic argument, because, like, if you take Wollongong, for example, you've got 19,000 people commuting from Wollongong to Sydney, but only 17% of them are doing it by public transport. Most people drive. That's because their jobs are all over Sydney. They're not just all in Central or on the line. So if you imagine a faster rail connection doubled that number, so the number is 3,200, you double that, and this is because of Sydney-siders moving to Wollongong but keeping their Sydney jobs, you'd be talking less than 4% of Sydney's population growth in a normal year, pre-COVID year. Same sort of thing for Geelong. Of the 14,000 who commute, only 3,400 do it by public transport. A lot of them, and the only ones who do it by public transport are city workers, CBD workers. Quite a lot of people come from Geelong and they work in the west, but they very predominantly drive because they're working all over the place, probably have free parking when they get there. So again, you double it, 3% of Melbourne's population growth in a year. Gold Coast, same thing. So I guess what I'm saying here really is it's just not enough to make a difference to population pressures. To go back to your question about more pressing pressures elsewhere, I think that is the right question to be asking. Is this the greatest need that Geelong's got? Is this the greatest need that Wollongong has got? And we don't have to dream up the answer. The state infrastructure bodies have got answers for this, and they say for regional cities and towns, the most pressing needs are things like internet and mobile connectivity, very relevant to working from home, better freight links, and also transport links between regional centres and surrounding communities, so not necessarily into the centre. And when they do talk about into the centre, often people will say more frequent services rather than necessarily faster services. So, I mean, there's nothing wrong with better connections. Of course, there's not. Better connections are a good thing, and quicker connections are good. I think the real question is, what is it instead of? And is this the best thing? Is this the most valuable thing for those communities?
Thanks, Marion. Just keeping an eye on the conversations that are coming through on the chat as well, and obviously people are getting into some of these issues about COVID impacts. You know, the COVID will obviously or potentially has a significant opportunity to change the way we work and travel, and has, I think, really opened up new ways of thinking about how businesses engage with workforces, where people work, those sorts of things. And, you know, there's even conversations happening around how we, you know, can potentially accommodate Australia's future population growth. Vincent, as somebody that's actually chosen to come and live in Australia, what impact do you think COVID-19 will have on our population and current faster rail plans? And before you answer the question, you may need to speak up because we've had a few people commenting that you are a little hard to hear.
Okay, thanks, Andrew. I hope this is better. Yeah, I think Australia, I mean, it's quite well known, is an attractive place for people to relocate into. And there's a myriad of reasons why people dream of coming to Australia and why they choose to actually come here. But I mean, essentially, there's two things that are quite related to this faster rail. And the first one is high-paying jobs, and the second one will be like the lifestyle and the fact that you have lots of very nice spaces available, even if you work in the city. And I think both of these are really relevant to faster rail because it can help you. It can help people go into these lifestyle locations that they dream of, and it can also it can do that while keeping a high-paying job potentially in the city. And I think the uncertainty here is around what COVID is going to do to the commuting. Is it really going to have people, if they commute 2-3 times a week, maybe a faster rail makes sense. But if you commute one time a week, is that really sufficient to sustain a faster rail demand on the corridor? This is a question. So there's a bit of a degree here, and depending on the outcome of the whole working from home with COVID, we could get different solutions, the need for different solutions for faster rail. But I think, like, to me, it's a bit of a different subject, I have to admit, but I think one thing that the COVID crisis has highlighted is that the different types of disruptions that people are talking about, they actually happen. And definitely a pandemic is a big one, but there's a number of other potential disruptions that are on the way. And I think it's quite worth reflecting on those when planning for this faster rail and not thinking them as kind of like high-flying risks that are maybe going to occur, but like things that could potentially actually happen, and what happens to my big faster rail program if this happen. And of course, the big one is climate change. And do I want to move people into locations where there's a drought? Like, do I want to have a water cistern attached to all the faster rail trains that go into these towns? There's a bit of issues around coastal erosions, about excessive heat, and things like this. But there's also a lot of other risks. And actually, like before this, I was looking at the UK National Risk Register for the civil risk registers, and so pandemic was actually the one that they highlighted as the most risk, as the most likely to happen, and the one with the most risk. But they also have a bunch of other things down there, including climate change, but also including political geotension. And I think that's quite relevant to Australia, because if you want to build a lot of housing in these regional towns, you will need investors. And in Australia, these investors tend to come from overseas, so you need to make sure that they will be able to come and invest to build these towns. We can't hear you, Andrew.
Apologies, put myself back on. Marion, to go back to you, obviously a couple of weeks ago we saw the Regional Australia Institute came out with a study that suggested that millennials were bucking the trend as far as shifting to major capital cities and instead tending to favour staying in, those that already lived in regional cities, staying in regional cities. What do you think in terms of, whether this trend is likely to continue, and does that potentially have implications for the analysis that you undertook?
Yeah, we had a look at this, at population movements as part of this report that we published. I guess what I'd say is the existing regional rail network was rolled out in the 19th century to the countryside and regional economy that at that time was thriving. So since then, there's been a steady decline in the proportion of the population outside major cities, very strong decline. And it's been driven by very powerful economic forces. So we see we have seen over that period a strong trend to centralisation of population and activity, a marked decline in rural inland towns, and a growth in coastal locations. So that's over the long span, 100-year span. I think it will always be the case that some people will stay in rural and regional areas, some will move from one rural or regional area to another, and some people will move there from the city. But the strongest force is urbanisation, the move to cities. So not just capital cities, although they've grown massively, but it does include regional cities, and some of them have grown very strongly too. And this is a global phenomenon, of course. It's not just here in Australia. And there are good reasons why people move to cities. Now, some people think governments should try to fight the trend towards urbanisation, try to get people to move out to regional cities and towns. And the thinking goes that it would boost regional communities, some of which are struggling, the non-coastal ones in particular, and it would take pressure off cities. So there's been this kind of argument about regional rail. I suppose my own view is that people are generally the best judges of where they should live. So some people are concerned about being close to friends and family and employment opportunities. They're the big things, really. I think if people want to live in a regional city or a rural town, why shouldn't they? But I think a lot of the time that's not what people are choosing. So it is pretty unaffordable to live in the capital cities, especially Sydney, and so you can see why there's this constant movement in and out as some people move in for the opportunities and some move out for different lifestyle or less expensive housing. But I basically think rather than try to get people to live somewhere that isn't their first choice, it would make sense to me to ensure that wherever people do choose to live does have adequate services and amenities to support them.
Thanks, Marion. If we can turn to sort of planning and appraisal now, I think, Andrew, you've obviously looked in, as I've previously mentioned, been doing some work in Australia and without prejudicing that work that you did for the New South Wales government, did you have any takeaways from your work here about how we go about planning and for regional passenger rail in Australia? And how that might differ from Europe, and also what you think of our economic appraisal methodology. Now, I should mention that I stuck you on mute before because there was a little bit of feedback, and I can't unmute you, so you might have to unmute yourself.
Okay, is that working?
Yes.
Good. Okay, gosh, there's some big questions in there. Let's try and get into a couple of comments about what colleagues have just said. And again, reflecting on the Australian situation, I don't think anywhere it's particularly successful building cities in deserts and then forcing people to go and work in them. unless you're in a sort of managed economy like China. We live in a free democracy. People want to live in good places. Many of the existing cities are in good places. They've got a reason to exist. So this is really about how you make them more attractive. I think it's dangerous slipping back into talking about rail and transport in terms of commuting. I do think in Australia you're obsessed with commuting rather than travel for every other purpose that exists. And certainly for, if you're talking about moving across a metropolis, then obviously commuting is important. But intercity travel, interregional, between regional cities, commuting will always be a minority sport. That people move around for all sorts of reasons. They're social animals. And I think that then plays back into the way you appraise projects. Sorry, last comment. If you do small incremental changes to an historical marvel called your regional rail network, then frankly, you won't achieve anything. I mean, it's just sort of Keynesian economics, really. You'll employ a few people with shovels. What proper modelling shows is you have to make a significant step change difference, and then you will get a significant step change response. The key is to make cities sustainable, where people don't have to go commuting every day to Sydney or Melbourne. They go to Sydney or Melbourne for all sorts of other reasons, and people in Sydney and Melbourne go to them for all sorts of other reasons. It is that umbilical cord. It is not just a better commuting system. Now, so I have to be careful here. You have inherited, the way you do transport appraisal, you've largely inherited from the United Kingdom, and frankly, it is rubbish. And I say that as a resident of the United Kingdom. So well done for copying something which is pretty rubbish. There are better ways of doing this. And again, I am seeing in Australia some voices beginning, not only understanding that, but really beginning to lead. And we back here in Britain are learning from you. One of them is, so much of this is about development. How do you value development other than waiting 20 years and going, that really did happen, but how could we have predicted it? LUTI modelling, land use transport interaction, is something that I have used now several times. And when you back integrate it into previous projects, I'm beginning to see a good correlation between what it predicts and what actually happens. It's quite a good predictor of when a city becomes so self-sustaining because of that umbilical cord that it takes off by itself. These are kind of like 100-year investments. And other techniques like CGE modeling are more difficult, because if you're predicting what happens over 30 or 40 years or 50 years, then of course isolating the transport effects from all the other mega effects becomes really difficult. But it's an indicator that when all these different techniques point in one direction, it doesn't actually matter what the BCR is to do 2 decimal places. What matters is telling you there will be a response to an investment. If you want that response, if you want the regional city to really take off, for us, our second city, Birmingham, has been in the doldrums for 50 years. We've announced we'll make it less than an hour from London. Already 2 multinationals have said they'll move their entire operation to Birmingham. They don't want to commute to London. They want to live in Birmingham. The CEO can commute to London when he needs to. Back to, it's not about mass commuting. It's about making cities grow, or enabling cities to grow. And those kind of modeling techniques start to predict the response you'll get in somewhere like, I don't know, Newcastle on the Hunter, Central Coast, Wollongong, wherever, that you apply them. In some places, you'll get a really strong response. In others, it's pretty marginal because there are other problems like water, like power, and that's okay. where you get a response, you can then say, this is where it's worth doing faster rail.
All right, Vincent, just out of interest, you having worked professionally in France in this area, what do you think about our evaluation framework methodology system in this country? How do the French do it differently?
I think that's a very good and a bit of a tricky question, and I don't think that I'm sufficiently across any of the two systems to make a full answer to that question, but I would say that the process in France is probably a bit more overtly politicized, and there's a bigger recognition that long-term strategic decisions are inherently political decisions, and that the appraisal process is really here to give indicators as to how to proceed with this policy vision. And I think it was certainly the case with the high-speed rail network, where in the past 5 years, there has been a bit of a slowdown because of financial constraints, but in the preceding years, it was really about realizing a policy vision and helping that policy vision comes true. And so I think that would be, to me, the main difference is that it's and that can even go into how you build the appraisal process. And I think there has been in Australia some very heated debates about the discount rates, for instance. And I think there's maybe a better recognition that this is really a political decision, whether you want short-term investment, you have a high discount rate. If you want long-term, you have a smaller one. But it's really about your policymakers to decide, and that can go about a bit of everything. And definitely, I think there has been a trend in France as well towards a bit more technocratization and the development of more technocratic guidelines and so on. But I think inherently that would be, to me, the main difference. Yeah.
So, Marion, if you've got our current system on one end of the spectrum, and potentially a politicised French system, not suggesting that ours isn't, but on the other end of the spectrum, and given the nature of rail infrastructure in particular, the technology, the infrastructure itself is so long-lived. What do you think we need to be sort of thinking about in terms of, our current appraisal framework or methodology looks at a sort of 30 to 50 year time horizon, potentially, if you're lucky. How do we ever kind of get these projects to stack up if you're really not looking at a long enough time horizon to allow them to stack up?
Yeah, I was sort of hoping the discussion would get here, actually, because there's a lot of debate about this kind of question, and I think that a lot of the supporters or advocates for rail do make the point that these are very long-lived pieces of infrastructure, and plenty of people think we should try to get ahead of an upstream of demand and build a legacy for future generations. The other side of this argument is that there's things we need today that should be higher priority. And it does come down to how do you value the future relative to what we build for the current generation. And so it does come down to discount rates. I suppose I sort of take Andrew's point about how we might have taken on the methodology with a excessive enthusiasm. But I suppose my view about this is that it's a cost-benefit analysis is a very imperfect tool, but it is the tool we've got, and we try to compare projects and proposals on a like-for-like basis, however imperfectly we do it. So the discount rate is just really important in all of this, and I have been trying to prosecute a case about this for some time. So for probably many of you listening are very familiar with it, but it's a device to put costs and benefits that occur at different points in time onto a comparable time footing, so that you can make direct comparisons between things like high-speed rail, which won't be finished for 50 years after beginning it, compared to a regional rail upgrade, which might give regional passengers a faster trip in a few years' time, or anything else you can use to put on the same time footing. So what we do in Australia is we've got this discount rate that we insist on using that's stuck at 7% and has been for over 30 years. And it's a problem because one of the key factors driving the discount rate is the cost of money to the government. And over 30 years, that's fallen dramatically from around 7% in real terms to around 0 or even below that today. So the implication is that we judge far too harshly those projects, often rail projects are in this category, where the benefits aren't going to be seen for a long time. And we give too much priority to projects where the benefits occur in the near term. Now, that's to the extent that we listen to the findings of the cost-benefit analysis, and I guess we're all acknowledging that that's only to a rather limited extent. But it's, you know, we've developed this tool to answer this kind of question. Cost-benefit analysis, discount rate is a core part of that tool. So I guess my view is we should use the tools that we've got, and we should improve them and use them as well as we can. So it's a long answer to your question, I guess, Andrew, but I think for as long as we keep using an artificially high discount rate in assessing proposals, those long-term or even nation-building proposals are simply going to struggle to look competitive compared to proposals with nearer-term benefits.
Right, thank you. Vincent, where do you fit on the economic purism versus pragmatism end of the spectrum in terms of assessing projects like, you know, interregional faster rail? You're on mute.
There's definitely a case to have a bit of both, and I think what's important is to really assess the projects, and I think it's a point Andrew has already made, for what they were advertised for. So if you have a project that's supposed to relieve congestion in the cities and build regional development in other cities, that should be the main emphasis. And so we need to make sure that we have the right tools, and certainly LUTI is one of the tools that we can have to understand this and to evaluate this as part of a framework. And I think this is not going, I think there's a way, like especially if you go into models that are quite economically developed, to have this be within the traditional economic appraisal framework, and so to have some form of economic purism, but it's just not yet in the guidelines. And but definitely, I think that there would be a way to evaluate the benefits that people moving to these regional locations get, and to make sure that this is properly accounted for in the appraisal, because this is really about what these projects are. So we really need to understand how many people are likely to shift and what utility they get out of shifting into there. So what benefit they get out of shifting into there. And I don't think this goes against the standard appraisal framework. It's just a slight improvement to it. And I would say also that probably another improvement that I think would really help in understanding and like comparing these different projects, we really need to go a bit deeper into the stakeholder analysis and really making sure we understand who is benefiting from the, like, who benefits and who does not, and make sure that this is front and center of the analysis. And it's because I think it's already done in most of the appraisals. You have some multi-criterion analysis, and that gives you an indication of the main beneficiaries of the projects and why they beneficiate. But I really think it's important to have this as the main, rather than a BCR having this as the main element to assess the projects.
You're shaking your head there, Andrew. You're on mute.
BCR has got its role, but it's a role. To me, it is less important than having a long-term plan that you build progressively. It's useful in describing perhaps the order in which you do things, but I can't think of many major investments that have created modern civilization where BCR was either positive or a driver. Even a metro like our Jubilee line, the BCR was zilch. But as a result of building it, we have created new communities, whole new patterns of work, whole new patterns of environment. Same is true with water, power, whatever. You've got to decide what sort of country you're going to be and how you're going to connect up. It's an indicator, it's no more.
And certainly, I think I've worked in land transport market reform, dealing with things like road pricing, potential road pricing reform, And I think the sort of the evaluation framework is in part trying to depoliticize, decision-making processes. But there's also, we are living in a democracy, and there is a role, obviously, for politicians to make investment decisions that sort of reflect things that, don't necessarily come to, questions of economic analysis. Well, we're at that stage now where we'll take some questions from the audience, and I see there's been comments coming through thick and fast, and I would just remind people to be respectful in the comments. But if we can turn to some of the comments that I've jotted down as we've been going. So Jeff Moran has indicated that getting people out of cars requires a 20-minute travel time saving. Andrew, I think you've talked earlier about sort of that sweet spot. I think if you sort of think about it logically, that sweet spot probably changes depending in which parts of, a country you're dealing with, or, commute times, the agglomeration effects of the cities. What's your view about a 20-minute travel time saving? I think you're back on mute.
Okay, sorry. If that's what makes a difference to the way people behave, then good. If that's not enough to make a difference, then not good. Back to people who talked, I know, in Australia about 30-minute cities. That's, I think, fairly well understood. Cities that are bigger than 30 minutes across basically are not single cities. They're just horrible North American sprawls. 1 hour, I can demonstrate, if we have more time, is the sweet spot where people can choose where they live and work. They can choose to meet their friends almost spontaneously. They can choose to go to events. Tourists come and visit they may land in Sydney, and you will have tourists again, because it's big business. They won't go somewhere which is so far away that they think they need protective equipment. An hour is a magical thing. That's all. And if if a significant upgrade achieves that, all well and good. By and large, you will find that building new, if you do it sensibly and if you invest in your infrastructure industry, is very little more expensive than fiddling around with what you've got. Break out of history and build what you want for the future, not just fiddle around with what you built 200 years ago.
I noticed there's a comment from Russell and from Ian as well that sort of touch on a kind of a similar issue around that sort of vision. And certainly I like quite like the concept of this idea of, rather than trying to bite off, a major piece of infrastructure in one go, do what we did with our national highway system, for example, where we had a very long-term vision that we would, divide and separate out, create dual carriageways, bypass towns. And I think that we're actually very close now to having achieved that all the way between, I think, the Sunshine Coast right down to Melbourne. Marion, what do you think about that sort of idea of, rather than trying to kind of justify, major pieces of infrastructure, spanning, significant distances, that we approach these sorts of things far more incrementally, like we have with, say, the National Highway System?
Yeah, I think it has been a real success story. It's like a very long-term thing. And I sort of personally remember how long it used to take to drive. Like, I used to think it was 12 hours to drive to Sydney. I don't know if that's just got worse in my mind. But road travel is really important in this country. It has been for a long time. It's important for both passengers and freight. And the National Highway System, I think, is a huge achievement, making travel between cities and through the regions much faster, but also much, much safer. So the road toll has really declined dramatically in that period. I guess I'm not sure exactly how comparable rail is to road. Rail accounts for a tiny fraction of passenger movements, So for the interstate movements, it's tiny, whereas driving, it's not all flying. A lot of it is driving. Sort of, I think a quarter of Sydney to Brisbane trips are driving, and a third of Melbourne to Adelaide trips are by driving. Road's really important for freight. So, and although rail is important for freight, I think that's predominantly bulk freight. So they're not, like they're kind of not exactly comparable. I think what stands out to me about rail and the notion of a long-term vision is that the goal, I think, would be taking people out of cars and out of planes more than it would be enabling whole new trips that wouldn't otherwise happen. And I think that's probably a point of difference with the highway network. So it comes down to the points that Andrew was making in the previous question, was about that for that to happen, rail would need to compete on door-to-door travel time, but also on sort of reliability, which I think rail's good on, but, service frequency and cost and convenience and so on. So that these are the challenges today. And today, only a tiny proportion of travellers do choose rail for a regional or intercity trip. So I sort of think the lessons for the highway network, not to sort of take away from that strategy, but it is kind of horses for courses. I'm just not convinced that the similarities are as clear as we might wish.
Vincent, you're obviously very skilled and experienced in modelling in terms of this sort of notion of incrementalism versus doing it all in one go. What do you think about sort of the potential opportunities there? I guess if you were going to do it incrementally, you grow it progressively out from major capital cities, and hopefully improve it for travel times for people along the corridor.
I think it's a bit of a tricky question here, because I suspect most of the modeling we do at the moment will not be able to make the difference. And if you look at the starting point and the end point, you probably arrive at the same place, whether it's incremental or whether it's a big shift. And that's definitely a shortcoming that needs to be looked at, because I entirely agree that this is completely different. Like having 1 minute less every year, or having half an hour less in 30 years would lead to very different responses. But it's definitely something that we should be able to deal with, and I'm sure we can deal with this. But I would suspect that most of the modeling we do is not at the moment. I mean, and I would gladly hear Andrew's views on that.
I think we're getting caught up with the word incremental. It's for me, this is about staging, so that you do a first stage, and I think this is what, Andrew, you were meaning. A first stage, you make a significant difference to somewhere. You see the response. It gives you the confidence to invest in a next stage to somewhere else. You see the response. You're doing it against a long-term framework, and that, I think, is where your comparison with the National Highways thing is very, very strong. But this is not about 2 minutes a year quicker to everywhere. Do something bold. Surprise yourself that actually the mega economic impacts are what you hoped, and it's not about value of a minute's journey time kind of rubbish that we get obsessed about in Britain. Do somewhere bold, learn, then do the next stage, and you don't overwhelm your construction industry trying to do everything at once either.
Just on that, with your experience, Andrew, internationally, are you hearing any kind of talk around that countries overseas will be looking at, things like faster rail, high-speed rail as a, major response, economic stimulus response?
Thank you. The answer is yes, actually. I'm off next week to Central Europe, where countries which are typically in population pretty much the size of New South Wales, for example, are having the same issues of a thriving capital city and struggling regional cities with an historic rail network, a road network that is congested. They realised that if you stick around, they've got a road network, but let's do something very different. They have learned the successes and failures of high-speed and fast rail around the world, and they're intending to invest in networks whilst the cost of capital is low, in order to do exactly the sorts of things we've been talking about in this webinar, to make regional cities sustainable on their own basis, not as long-distance commuter cords, but as sustainable regional cities. And for that, they need better connectivity, along with better connectivity of broadband and other things that people have talked about.
Thank you, Vincent. Noting, of course, that the French experience has been both positive and negative. Do you think that France would have done things differently now had it known what their system was like now? And I'm thinking particularly about sort of the potential regional impact. So some towns kind of benefited and some towns, actually faced disbenefits, so to speak.
Yeah, I think that's definitely like one of the low points of the high-speed rails, that there were really high hopes about regional development, and this has not maybe materialized as much as people had hoped. But I think otherwise, it has been overall a very significant investment that people are proud of and that people are quite happy of, and it's still it's yielding ongoing returns, and I don't think many people regret these returns at this stage. So there's definitely at the margins some things that people would do maybe before or after, or they would have stopped before. Maybe we've been a bit too far in terms of high-speed rail and we didn't need to go that far. But at the same time, I don't think people would argue that it was a bad decision in the first place, and I don't think people would argue that it should have been done very differently.
Marion, how does that make you feel?
The studies I've seen have shown I would say, first of all, I love traveling on the TGV. Who doesn't? But the studies I've seen have shown that it is the bigger centres that tend to get the lion's share of the benefits. So I'm just sort of circumspect about it. The distribution of the benefits is not necessarily what people imagine they're going to be. So, just circumspect, I think, Andrew.
Excellent. Well, I think we've timed it perfectly. I think on that note, we'll bring the session to a close. I'd certainly like to provide my warm thanks to Beach Lister for hosting this session webinar today. Certainly I found it very interesting, and hopefully everybody who's dialed in has found it very interesting. And also thank you to our panelists, Marion, Andrew and Vincent. And thank you all for dialing in, and the comments have been coming thick and fast, and obviously people have been pretty engaged in this discussion as well. So hopefully you've all got a good amount out of this session today as well. So thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.